Hello everyone and welcome to this fantastic members only live stream. I'm Glenn and I'm very glad to be with you here today about a very interesting topic, ancient Egypt. Now, we all know something about ancient Egypt, right? Whether it's mummies, it's pyramids, it's King Tut, it just pervades our popular culture. But there's of course a lot more to ancient Egypt than just King Tut and mummies and pyramids, though we will be covering those. And we're going to be going very far back in time, and I want to emphasize that as with all of our nutshell histories, this is very, very nutshell. Ancient Egypt, depending upon how you count it, covers about 3 to 3.5 thousand years of history. And it is a remarkably long period of time, but we're going to try to cover it. And, just to give you an idea of how long ago we're talking about, again, most of us think of King Tut. We know about King Tut, Tutankhamun. There is as much history in Egypt before him as there is between us today and him. Just to give you an idea of how long ago we're talking about and trying to place that in context. So, ancient Egypt is very, very ancient. And the ancient Egyptians themselves had what they would have considered ancient history going all the way back to their origins. So, let's get started with a super basic timeline. This timeline just sort of shows you how far back we're going. We have the early dynastic period. Now, what this means is when we finally get to a point where there are organized civilizations, where there are kingdoms up and down the Nile River, and we'll get to why it's the Nile in a second, they began to, of course, pass kingdoms down from usually father to son, a dynasty. And so only at that point did we really consider this a dynastic period. Before that, we're talking about, almost Stone Age, almost Neolithic peoples. And it's very interesting, this long ago, the area that is now Egypt and was ancient Egypt was actually not sand and desert the way we think of it today, sort of that eastern edge of the Sahara. It was very much more of a savanna. It was almost like the rest of sub-Saharan Africa is today. Not quite jungle, but things were very green. There was vegetation. There were herds of animals wandering about. And it's only since that time, because of lots of geographic and meteorological changes, that Egypt became what we think of today as mostly desert. But this dynastic period began, and we have a lot of dynasties that we divide things into. But we predominantly think of ancient Egypt as all of the dynastic period and the old, the middle, and the new kingdom, with some intermediary periods in there, in between those different kingdoms. Those are sort of you could say, the height of the respective cultures. And again, we're talking about literally several thousand years. So of course, there are going to be peaks and troughs in the culture, in the region, in the political entity that is ancient Egypt. You're finally going to get to the late period, and depending upon, again, how you count it, Egypt comes under the control of foreign powers about 330 BC with Alexander the Great, who comes across, he's trying to conquer the Persians. The Persians have come in fairly recently, conquered Egypt. Alexander comes through, conquers the Persian Empire, and takes Egypt with it. With the fall of Alexander, you have the Greek Ptolemaic line dynasty from around the 330s BC up until 30 BC, which is when Antony and Cleopatra are defeated by Caesar Octavius or Augustus, and it becomes part of the Roman Empire for the rest of what we think of as the ancient period. So yes, we're talking about ancient Rome, Caesar, Cleopatra, and all that stuff is very, very recent, not ancient compared to what we're going to be talking to. Let me go into this next timeline that shows just a little bit more detail for you. And you can see how things are divided up. And again, different scholars view things a little differently based on the records, based on contextualization of some of the finds. We'll get to how we know what we know in a little bit too. But when we're talking about pyramids, which is probably one of the main things we think of with ancient Egypt, you have to think about how far back they go. I mean, look at this. We're talking about 2500 BC is when the pyramids and the Sphinx are actually created. And most of what we think of as ancient Egyptians, the pharaohs, King Tut, and things like that, are about 1500 to 1,000 years after the pyramids are built. So the pyramids are over 1,000 years old when King Tut comes around. But again, just trying to put this in the great context of the timeline. What is ancient Egypt geographically and politically? On the next slide, you can see that ancient Egypt is in effect the Nile River. Now, that means it starts out as a very thin sliver of fertile valley, incredibly fertile, because the Nile not only floods based on the season, but generally speaking, it floods very regularly. They know exactly what time of year the flood is going to happen, so they'll know when to plant their crops. The crops will be irrigated. The river will go down. They'll be able to harvest the crops and things like that. So you can see from the map that there's the Nile Delta, which is where the Nile sort of splits off in a delta format, a geographic format, that goes into the Mediterranean, the southeastern Mediterranean. But the Nile River itself has all these different twists and turns. And originally, Egypt was divided into many different kingdoms, but eventually into the upper and lower kingdoms. The upper being what we think of as the bottom, the upper part of the Nile, and then the lower part, Lower Egypt, the northerly part of the Nile. The capital of Upper Egypt was Thebes. The capital of Lower Egypt was Memphis. And you have to understand that this move to agriculture in the ancient days is really what set Egypt apart, and it had the advantage because of these regular cycles of flooding that could create a vast amount, not only of food, but of surplus. That's really, you have to understand, that's the beginnings of any civilization in ancient times, is having a surplus of food. When you have a surplus of food, you have to organize it. That means someone has to be in charge. And not everyone has to farm. You can have people take on other jobs, such as being in charge, or doing the organizing, or trying to trade to some other areas. So merchants come in, trade comes in, and the Nile River becomes an incredibly rich part of that area, and that is what makes Egypt so powerful. Because of that surplus, because of that expansion of power, eventually the upper and lower kingdoms of Egypt are combined into one kingdom, and they're able to go and begin not just farming, but exploiting the natural resources, stone quarries, gold and silver mining, and trade with other areas. As the politics get more set, as the Egyptian kingdom becomes more powerful, of course, they're able to develop armies. And by developing armies, they're able to not only defend themselves from invasion and have their resources stolen, but they're able to go in and take other resources and take other land. So the map you see here, the dark green really is the Nile Valley. It seems like just a thin sliver, but you have to consider the massive amount of wealth that comes from that. And outside that, the lighter green is what becomes the kingdom of Egypt at its height under Ramses around 1300 BC. So you can see it is a vast empire that controls not just the Nile Valley, but up all the way into the eastern Mediterranean, what we call the Levant, or the Middle East, Syria, what's now Syria, and places like that. So Egypt becomes very, very powerful, and this is all because of flooding and of agriculture. So the politics, who's in charge? Well, we know who's in charge. It's the Pharaoh. Eventually, again, sort of compressing time together, the Pharaoh becomes not just a king over the people, but he ascends to, in effect, godhood. Because the way Egypt is able to be organized, the way the population is able to be controlled and set on a path of singular vision to create things like the pyramids and the Sphinx is, again, someone has to be in charge and you have to organize that population. The way the Egyptians do that really is through religion and religious practices. So it makes sense that the leader of the state has to himself be a god associating with the deities of the Egyptian pantheon. And we'll come back to those in a second. But the Pharaoh is the government. And really, almost all the produce of Egypt, whether it's small peasant farmers or more wealthy families that control larger areas of the Nile Valley, they all answer to the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh is, in effect, Egypt. And everyone serves him and is not his slave per se, but in effect owes him allegiance all the way up and all the way down the social chain. So you see here an original image of a Pharaoh in the middle, and he's sort of being blessed by and hanging out with his fellow gods, right? Here, Anubis, and I believe this is Isis. But this shows, and of course, every Pharaoh, as they ascend to the thrones of Upper and Lower Egypt, have to reinforce their godhood and their deity to maintain control. So the rest of society, what are they going to do? They're going to be, peasants and farmers and things like that. We've got another great illustration that shows how society and the work they kind of did. And you can see here, there's a lot of farming. You can see the guys sitting over here to the right, they're the guys in charge. Not the Pharaoh necessarily, but perhaps some of the Pharaoh's lieutenants, perhaps some of the heads of the wealthier families who actually own the land or operate the land for the Pharaoh. And they're going to be harvesting, they're going to be storing the food supplies, they're going to be trading and organizing those food supplies, both men and women. And again, this is something that is a central controlling and unifying factor for all Egyptian culture. Now, what's interesting is we're still talking about the Bronze Age. And you can see in the bottom picture, they're cutting down some trees with bronze axes. These are probably not the property of those farmers. Those are incredibly valuable and expensive items. They probably belong to the guy sitting over on the right, and he just has his people use them when he needs some trees cut down. Again, not a lot of trees in Egypt, so wood becomes a material that is not it's not super rare, but it is not common. They began to use more things like stone and things like that. But they do have agriculture, they do have domesticated animals, again, as you see from that bottom panel. And again, they're able to organize all this because they study the flooding cycles of the Nile. And in the next picture, you can see another period illustration of folks actually doing some measuring. You can see the line they have, the string, there's a foreman there sort of organizing it. They're able to measure exactly where the flood is usually going to come to. They'll know where to put their fields, when to plant, when to harvest, and things like that based on those floods. So we get a lot of this great information from a lot of these tomb paintings and perhaps some papyrus scrolls. But Egyptian society was very, very organized, and it was very, very hierarchical. And again, how was that done? Through religion. So we move into the pantheon of the Egyptian gods and who they are. Now, there are a lot of Egyptian gods. We've got a picture here representing just a few. But again, in about 3,000 years worth of history, you're going to have a pantheon and religion that changes a little bit in some ways and changes a lot in other ways. Again, there are movements sometimes with the pharaohs who claim godhood. There are some that decide that instead of all these other gods, we want a monotheistic approach, and those people do come to power very briefly. Akhenaten is one of the foremost ones who tries to set up a monotheistic, but please note, all of these still reinforce the idea of the pharaoh as in charge of everything. We can't go into all the gods, but they have varying amounts of power. Ra, the sun god, generally is considered one of the most important and the most powerful, but is not in what we think of as the Greek gods, with Zeus being in charge and the father. That's not really what Ra is. He just has a lot of the focus and the power, but there's no one really in charge of the Egyptian gods. Some of them work together, some of them work diametrically opposed. There is Anubis, who is the god of the body and of the embalming process, and we'll get to that in just a second. There is Isis and Osiris. Osiris is the god of the afterworld and has a lot to do with Egyptian afterlife, which becomes incredibly important. The Egyptians, simply put, are obsessed with what happens after death, with the afterlife, not just with their bodies, but with their spirits, and much of Egyptian religion revolves around this. And Isis and Osiris give birth to Horus, who is sort of the falcon god and controls the sky and things like that. So there are a lot of Greek gods. I'll let you look up all of them, but just suffice to say that each city, each pharaoh, depending upon the time we're looking at, tends to focus on one or more of these gods at once. But everyone thinks about Anubis, and everyone thinks about mummification. So what is the deal with that? We've got this great illustration of an embalmed, perhaps not a pharaoh, but certainly someone who is of high status. And here's Anubis with the dog head, right? He's a god with a dog head. And Anubis is kind of watching after the body. Again, this is his job. So why are people mummifying? What is the point of preserving the flesh of the body? This has to do with the Egyptians and their afterlife and what they consider the body and the spirit to be. A person basically consists of several different aspects, or that's what they call them. The translation we have is aspects. There is, of course, the physical body. There is the sweet or swoot, which is the shadow. They're very observant. So you have a shadow. You have the ba, which is your personality, your soul, as it was, what makes you you. There is the ka, which is the life force itself, which actually motivates the body, the beating of the heart, the fluids. They didn't understand that, but they knew there's some life force course through your body making it work. That's the ka. And there is also, of course, your name. And this is one of the things I really like about Egyptian religion. Your name is a big part of who you are. And so when one dies, when one leaves this life, then the idea is that especially your aspects of the ba and the ka, your personality and your life force, must be preserved in some way. And so this is why they mummify people if they can afford it. And of course, the higher up the wealth and hierarchical scale you go, the more effort they put into preserving your body, and the dryness of Egypt and the desert helps. And they conserve your body, they conserve the parts of your body so that the ba and the ka can have something to reside in the afterlife for all time. If the human body can't make it, then perhaps you could have a statue. If you're rich enough to have a statue made of yourself, then your ba and your ka could reside within the statue, which is why you see so many statues of so many very high-ranking Egyptians, such as pharaohs and things like that. The statue could serve for that. But this is the purpose of mummification. And after mummification, of course, your ba and your ka sort of have to be judged. And in the next slide, this is from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which details the ceremonies of religious ceremonies and mummifications and things like this. And this is a great picture. You see someone has died, and at the left you have Anubis leading the person on, and then there's a set of scales. And part of the mummification process was to remove a person's heart. And in this picture, you see Anubis weighing the heart against a feather. And if the heart is lighter than a feather, in other words, you are happy and good, then you will be addressed, you will go into the afterlife, you will meet Osiris, who will welcome you into the afterworld, and everything will be great. However, if your heart weighs too much, then I can't remember the name of the god, but basically he is called the devourer, and he will come, consume your heart, consume your ka, and you will cease to exist on any plane, anywhere. Let that be a lesson to you for making sure that you do things right. So Egyptian Book of the Dead has all this. And again, this obsession with the afterlife is why we have mummies, why we have gigantic pyramids that serve as no other purpose than to be the tomb of pharaohs. But those pyramids and those tombs come to be icons of ancient Egypt. And the next picture is what we've had in the background. The great pyramids at Giza and the Sphinx. We know that the great pyramids were tombs. What in the world was the Sphinx made before even the Old Kingdom? Well, no one knows. The Sphinx is so old that even the ancient Egyptians apparently couldn't quite figure it out. It had just been built there. This is not aliens. People could make things. It just took a long time and a lot of labor. But when you have an entire rich nation state laboring to make things that you like, if you're Pharaoh, you can get it done. So, these iconographic things of Egypt speak to us. The Sphinx is a mystery. It's a riddle. But the pyramids we do know a little bit more about. The Great Pyramids at Giza are the ones we think of. The earliest Egyptian pyramids actually are stepped pyramids, much like what we see in Central and South America from the Mesoamerican cultures. Very interesting. But later on, you get a much more finished, much more flat-sided, four-sided pyramid. And each one of these are going to be tombs, right? And the blocks are huge, and there's tens of thousands of them, and they sort of have to stack them up at the bottom and go like this. You don't just start, by the way, stacking stones. The Egyptians were very advanced in surveying and mathematics and construction methods, because when you're building something this big with stones, you have to measure things out. You have to make sure things are level. You have to make sure things are going to fit together. You have to make sure that all the sides are going to be the same distance and meet at the top. It's not as easy as you might think, and it's a credit to how advanced some of these procedures were. And then the next picture, I just love this picture because you don't get to see this much. This is the very top of the Great Pyramid. Notice that it's kind of flat, right? There's some space up there. Experts think that at the very top of the pyramid was probably some sort of gold or gold-plated capstone that would, of course, make this seem like the most amazing thing in the world. But you can see, even looking down on this, these are all similar sized but irregularly cut stones. You get off in the distance and the pyramids look very smooth, but when you start to look at them up close, there's a lot more detail to it. There's a lot more roughness to it, but it's still certainly remarkable aspects of engineering. So let's take a look inside of one of these pyramids and see exactly what they are. You can see from this photograph that most of the pyramid is just stacked stone, right? It's just a big pile, but they have to leave chambers. And again, pharaohs, being gods, going to the afterlife, want to maintain their status and their quality of living in the afterlife, just as they've had in the life on earth. And so they want to prepare, they want to make sure their body remains incorrupt, that their statues remain incorrupt, that the things put in the tomb with them that they will be able to use in the afterlife remain there for all eternity. Pharaohs like expensive stuff, so they're being buried with lots of gold, lots of remarkable items, lots of jewelry, lots of expensive things. And you don't want people breaking into the tomb to steal them and sell them, which is sadly what has happened with almost all the ancient Egyptian tombs. That it's grave robbers, right? So you can see these chambers have incredibly elaborate access points. They have things where you can see right here, this pathway here is where you would have to go down, but up here they would make it so that when everything was ready to be sealed, these blocks would be released and they would just go boom, 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 landing on top of each other, theoretically absolutely preventing anyone from getting in there. Yet somehow grave robbers were still able to get in. The problem with putting a gigantic pyramid is that you're saying, hey everyone, here's a gigantic stack of gold, get to it if you can. Well, if people are clever enough to build pyramids, they're clever enough to break into them. And they're able to make their way in. And so pyramids become these mute testaments that see thousands of years of history pass before them. But pyramids are not the only architecture that the ancient Egyptians were able to create. There's lots of other things. There is Ramses II. There's a temple built by him, for him, with 4 figures outside in the front. One of the things, the pyramids at Giza used to be so far away that it took an expedition if you wanted to go visit them. But in this next picture, I just sort of wanted to place it in context. Giza is not in the middle of nowhere no more. You have the pyramid structure here, and you can see to the north and the northeast, just how close progress and expansion has come to this remarkable world historic site. People have to live, populations are going to grow, but fortunately they are preserving this area as best they can. But you can see how close and how near we are to encroachment upon this site. But fortunately, it's not just pyramids. There are actually a lot more architectural features and monumental building that took place in ancient Egypt. We have here a temple for Ramses II, the Pharaoh of the Old Testament, and Moses, who was one of the most powerful pharaohs in history in the New Kingdom. And he was able to conquer all those lands. That map I showed you at the first was in large part his doing. And you can see him on the far left. And he's so good that he has a couple of gods sitting there with him. And notice that the gods are smaller in stature than him. He had a very high opinion of himself. Interesting side note, to give you an idea of how remarkable and what engineering prowess modern people have. The Aswan Dam that was going to help control the flooding of the Nile was built, but this area was going to be inundated with water, and so the entire temple complex had to be taken apart stone by stone and moved to a higher hill, and we were able to do that to save it and preserve it. So that in itself is remarkable. You should look into that. That was a remarkable engineering feat of modern times. But there's also a temple at Thebes. And you can see the remarkable statuary work and just how much the Egyptians were able to do. Again, pyramids really are for the dead, but the Egyptians were also able to make lots of temple complexes to worship gods and to have places for the pharaohs to live in and amongst those capital cities of Thebes and Memphis and places like that. Now, let's get to a couple of the main points to hit for what most people think they know about ancient Egypt. Of course, the next image is probably the one that everyone thinks of. The death mask of Tutankhamun that was found by Howard Carter in the early part of the 20th century. And this is the one. This is what people think of when they think of the wealth of Egypt, the pharaohs, and things like that. And it is remarkable. But to put things in context, and many of you may know this from your other readings, Tutankhamun was actually a remarkably minor and almost insignificant pharaoh in history in the New Kingdom, which means that this gold face mask and all the wealth we think of that was found with him is just a little bit, right? It's kind of not much to it. Just to give you an idea of the kind of wealth that would have been put in a tomb with Ramses II or places like that. And this continuous study of ancient Egypt called Egyptology has fascinated people since the earliest times. Again, in the ancient Greek city-states around 400 and 500 BC, they considered the ancient Egyptians ancient, and they were absolutely fascinated with how old they were. The first written history we have from the Greeks, Herodotus, actually has a couple of chapters on, as much as he knew, about the ancient Egyptians because it was so incredibly fascinating. And this continues on. The Roman, of course, when Alexander of Macedon conquered the area, he built an entire city there on the Nile Delta because he was fascinated with the culture. When the Romans come, the Romans want to take over Egypt, not just because of its history, but because, believe it or not, Egypt, because of its agriculture, is one of the richest areas around the entire Mediterranean basin, and the Romans want it, so the Romans take it. But the Romans are also fascinated with this weird culture that takes place in Egypt up and down the Nile Valley. So this fascination with the culture, with the material culture, with the religion, with the people, with the history, has been with us for a long time, and that continued all the way up through the 1700s, 1800s, the 1900s. And with Egypt becoming a colonial state under the control of the Ottomans, under the control of France, under the control of Britain, on up into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they send teams of archaeologists, teams of academics to study what they can. Of course, over the ravages of centuries and millennia, much of what had been Egyptian had been taken away, had been lost because of the ravages of time. But much of it still remained, but no uncorrupted tomb of a pharaoh had ever been found. They thought that they would never be able to find one until Howard Carter, inspired, refusing to give up, trying to find Tutankhamun, finally found the tomb. And the next picture shows you, after excavations, what he saw that would have made his heart jump. This image on top is actually of Tutankhamun's tomb with the seals still intact. Those seals, when Carter found them, had been in place for about 3,000 years and had not been broken. And when he saw this, he knew with those seals intact that this was an intact tomb that no one had gotten into. This is something that had not ever been known or found by anyone in recorded history. And so when he finds this, they begin to excavate the tomb, and he is finding wonders and treasures, the likes of which it is almost impossible for him to describe. And you can see this picture on the bottom. This is a picture taken of things in the tomb. And that stuff sitting there just as it had been when they left it and sealed up the tomb 3,000 years before. And going to the next picture, you can see that the tomb complex for Tutankhamun to us seems like a remarkable find, but it's actually kind of small. You have the antechamber, which is the first area that Carter and his team discovered, and then a little bitty place, the annex, which is just some stuff that he might need for the afterlife, right? Barrels of wheat and things like that. And then to the right of the antechamber, the actual burial chamber with all these different layers of tombs and coffins and sarcophagi to protect the body, going all the way down to the actual mummy itself with its gold mask, and then a treasury with lots of wealth in it. And again, relatively small, insignificant pharaoh. The reason he's so popular is because he's the one that was found. And this was a world-renowned find. We're still living with the consequences of this today. Again, Egyptology has been the fascination of people not from Egypt. But here in the late 20th and coming into the early 21st century, we begin to realize that some of that has some issues that we really need to address. Many of the things going all the way back to Napoleon Bonaparte and his team finding the Rosetta Stone, which eventually led to us being able to translate the hieroglyphics on all of these tombs, to Lord Carter, to the colonialization of Egypt by the European powers, taking these things, because all the things that Carter found went to the British Museum in England, right? They didn't stay in Egypt. And part of that problem becomes, you can see where this is going. In the next photograph, we've got Carter there with Lord Carnarvon, who had funded this, and they're actually there kind of, going through the remains of an ancient Egyptian leader. Well, how would we feel about this if an archaeologist from, Italy decided to come in and crack open Abraham Lincoln's coffin just to see what kind of buttons were on his coat? It becomes an issue, and we're talking about a much larger issue. And so most of these things from this expedition have gone into the British Museum. You can see in the next picture. And lots of things have gone into French museums. And the question now has become, should these items be repatriated to Egypt? And quite frankly, I think we need to listen to the arguments on all sides. The argument of the Egyptians is that this was our property. This was and is our heritage. It belongs to us. It belongs to this land. It belongs to this people. And you, as colonizing forces, took it from us without our permission, without our consent, and have taken it back to your homes to gawk at and to study. A fair point. There's also a fair point to be made that many of these things would not have existed if they had not been saved and scavenged by Europeans and taken out of their original homelands. Again, this Egypt has been there for 3,500, 4,000 years. Time destroys things, and war and famine and natural disaster destroys things. And so much of what has been taken out has been preserved in ways that may never have happened if they had remained intact where they were. So they were saved. Will it be safe to send them back? How stable politically and economically are those areas where we'll be returning some of the most precious items of human history? This conversation is still going on, and it's a conversation that definitely needs to be had and needs to be continued, and a resolution needs to be found that I think is respectful of everyone. It may not be an easy thing to do, but it's part of the heritage of Egyptology, this fascination we have with ancient Egypt, to learn more about it, to see its monuments, to see its material culture, and how that is going to be preserved and shared and interpreted as we move forward is a fantastic question that we, of course, can't remotely speculate on today, because that is the future, not the past. And if you want to learn more about this particular past, there are, of course, thousands of books you can do, that you can check out, that you can read. There are documentaries, but here are just a quick three that I recommend. Of course, there's de Macroup's History of Ancient Egypt, which is a single volume, cram it all into one paperback book if you want to look for something like that. And then there's always, of course, the DK Eyewitness books. They're made for kids, but adults love them too. They are crammed full of fantastic color photography of all sorts of different finds, site visits, artifacts from ancient Egypt. And if you're like me and you spend a lot of time in the car, there's a great courses audiobook available on the history of ancient Egypt that you can get there. But again, there's a ton of sources you'll be able to find at your local library, your local bookstore, or your local interwebs connection. So, ancient Egypt is fascinating. We have just barely scratched the surface, but I hope it's inspired you to become more curious about it. That's all the time we have to talk about 3,000 plus years of history, but I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for being a member of the History Center. Thank you for your support, for making everything that we do possible. We hope to see you next time, but until we see you again, stay safe and take care.